The baby's cries echoed through the Morrison ranch house like the wail of a dying soul, growing weaker with each passing hour. 3 days since birth, 3 days since his mother had bled out on the very bed where he now lay starving, and 3 days since Jake Morrison had watched his world crumble into dust and desperation. Doc Wheeler shook his head grimly as he examined the tiny failing infant. "He won't last another day without milk, Jake. We've tried everything. Goat's milk, sugar water, even brought in a wet nurse from 2 towns over. Nothing's working. This baby needs human milk from a woman who's recently given birth, and there's only one person in Millbrook who fits that description." Jake's jaw clenched as he stared down at his son, his beautiful, perfect son who was slowly starving to death. He knew exactly who Dr. Wheeler meant. Elizabeth Carter, Lizzie, the woman who'd been his everything before life and cruel circumstances had torn them apart. The woman who'd given birth to her own child just 2 weeks ago, only to lose the baby to fever 3 days later. The woman who was now married to the most ruthless banker in 3 counties. The woman he still loved with every fiber of his being. "Richard Carter will never allow it," Jake said, his voice rough with pain and exhaustion. "He'd rather watch my son die than let his wife help me." Doc Wheeler's expression was grave. "Then you better hope love is stronger than pride, son. Because that baby doesn't have time for family feuds or old grudges." But there was more to this story than anyone in Millbrook knew. More than the surface tragedy of a motherless child and a grieving father. Because 15 years ago, Jake Morrison and Elizabeth Hayes had been childhood sweethearts, meeting in secret behind the old church, promising each other forever under the stars. They'd planned to run away together, to build a life where love mattered more than money or social standing. Until Elizabeth's father had discovered their secret romance and beaten her unconscious. Until he'd forced her into marriage with Richard Carter to pay off his gambling debts. Until Jake had been run out of town by Carter's hired thugs and told never to return. He'd come back 5 years ago, scarred and hardened by his time away, married a sweet woman named Mary, who deserved better than a man who could never fully give his heart. He'd built his ranch, tried to forget, tried to move on. But every time he saw Elizabeth in town, every stolen glance across the church aisle, every accidental meeting at the general store had reminded him that some kinds of love never die. They just learn to hide. Now Mary was gone, his son was dying, and the only woman who could save him was the one he'd never stopped loving. The one whose husband had made it clear that Jake Morrison was never to come near his property or his wife again. But as Jake looked down at his fading son, he realized that some things were worth risking everything for. Even if it meant facing Richard Carter's wrath, even if it meant destroying whatever fragile peace he'd built, even if it meant opening wounds that had never properly healed. The question was, would Elizabeth risk everything too? Would she defy her husband to save the child of the man she'd once promised to love forever? And more importantly, what would Richard Carter do when he discovered that his wife was nursing the baby of her secret former lover? The Carter mansion sat on the hill overlooking Millbrook like a fortress of wealth and power, its imposing white columns and manicured gardens a stark reminder of the social divide that had always separated Jake from the woman he'd never stopped loving. As he stood at the wrought iron gates in the pre-dawn darkness, his dying son wrapped in blankets against his chest, Jake Morrison felt every one of the 15 years that had passed since he'd been beaten and driven away from this place. The baby's breathing was so shallow now that Jake had to press his ear close to the tiny chest to hear it at all. Doc Wheeler had been right. They were down to hours, maybe less. The wet nurse from Silver Creek had tried for 2 days, but something about her milk wasn't right for the baby. He'd taken a little, enough to keep hope alive, but not enough to thrive, not enough to live. Jake had tried everything. Goat's milk mixed with sugar and water, cow's milk thinned with broth, even the expensive formula Dr. Patterson had ordered from back east. Nothing worked. His son was dying by degrees, and there was only one woman in the territory who could save him. The woman sleeping in the house beyond these gates. The woman whose own milk was going to waste while her breasts ached with loss, and her heart broke a little more each day. Jake knew this because Martha Henderson, the town's busiest gossip, had made sure everyone knew about Elizabeth Carter's recent tragedy. How she'd given birth to a perfect little girl only to watch fever take the child 3 days later. How she'd been seen wandering her garden at all hours, her dress front damp with the milk her body continued to produce for a baby who would never need it again. Richard Carter had made it clear that his wife was not to be disturbed in her grief. No visitors, no condolence calls, no charity work that might upset her delicate constitution. But Jake suspected the real reason was darker. Richard had always been a possessive man, and losing a child would only make him more controlling, more determined to keep Elizabeth locked away from the world, and especially from any man who might remind her of what her life could have been. The sound of footsteps on gravel made Jake step back into the shadows of the oak trees lining the drive. A figure emerged from the servants' entrance. Maria Santos, the Carter family's housekeeper, carrying a basket of laundry despite the early hour. She was a good woman, Jake knew, one of the few people in town who'd never judged him for his past or his present circumstances. "Maria," he called softly, stepping into the pale moonlight. She startled, nearly dropping her basket, then peered through the darkness. "Senor Morrison, what are you doing here? It's not even dawn." Jake pulled the blanket away from his son's face, and Maria gasped at the sight of the tiny pale child struggling for each breath. "My son is dying, Maria. Dr. Wheeler says only a woman with fresh milk can save him now." Maria's dark eyes filled with understanding and pain. "La Señora Elizabeth. She lost her bébé only a week ago. Her heart is broken, Senor Morrison." "I know, but she's the only one who can help him. Please, Maria, I'm not asking you to betray your employers. I'm asking you to save a child's life." Maria looked at the baby, then back at Jake's desperate face. She'd been with the Carter family for 20 years, had seen how Richard treated his wife, had witnessed the slow erosion of Elizabeth's spirit under his control. She'd also heard the whispered stories about Jake and Elizabeth's past, had seen the way Elizabeth's face changed whenever his name was mentioned. "El Señor Carter, he will be furious if he discovers this," she said quietly. "Then we make sure he doesn't discover it. At least not until my son is strong enough to survive without her." Maria was quiet for a long moment, studying Jake's face in the moonlight. Finally, she sighed and looked toward the big house. "La Señora, she walks in the garden every morning at sunrise. She cannot sleep since she lost her bébé. Always she goes to the rose garden behind the house where Senor Carter cannot see from his study window." Hope flickered in Jake's chest for the first time in days. "Will you tell her I'll be waiting there?" "See," Maria said softly. "But Senor Morrison, be very careful. If Senor Carter discovers you here, he will have you arrested, or worse." Jake nodded grimly. He knew exactly what Richard Carter was capable of. The man had built his fortune on the misery of others, foreclosing on desperate families and buying up their land for pennies on the dollar. He ruled his household with the same iron fist he used in business, and Jake had no doubt that Carter would see any attempt to help his dying child as a threat to his control over Elizabeth. But as Jake looked down at his son's face, so pale it was almost translucent in the moonlight, he knew he had no choice. Some risks were worth taking. The Rose Garden was Elizabeth's sanctuary, a place she'd created from nothing during the early years of her marriage when hope still lived in her heart. The roses were dormant now in the October cold, but their thorny branches created a maze of shadows and hiding places. Jake positioned himself behind a large trellis where he could see the path but remain hidden if anyone else appeared. He didn't have to wait long. As the first pale light of dawn began to creep across the sky, he heard the soft whisper of skirts on stone and the quiet rustle of someone moving through the garden. Then she appeared around the corner of the path, and Jake's breath caught in his throat. 15 years had changed Elizabeth Hayes into Elizabeth Carter, but she was still the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen. Her dark hair was longer now, pinned up in a style that suggested wealth and status rather than the wild curls he remembered. Her figure was fuller, softer, shaped by motherhood even in loss. She wore a deep blue wrapper that made her eyes look like storm clouds, and there was a sadness in her face that cut Jake to the core. She was also visibly struggling with the physical aftermath of recent childbirth. Her posture spoke of discomfort, of a body that had done what nature intended but been denied its purpose. As she walked, she pressed a hand to her chest, where Jake could see the telltale dampness that meant her milk was coming down. "Lizzie," he called softly. She spun around with a sharp intake of breath, her hand flying to her throat. When she saw him emerging from the shadows, her face went through a series of expressions: shock, recognition, joy, and then fear. "Jake?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "What are you? You can't be here. If Richard sees you." "My son is dying," Jake said simply, pulling the blanket away from the baby's face. "And you're the only one who can save him." Elizabeth's eyes went wide as she took in the sight of the tiny, struggling infant. Her maternal instincts, already raw from her own recent loss, kicked in immediately. She took an unconscious step forward, her arms moving as if she wanted to take the child but didn't dare. "Oh God," she breathed. "How long has he been like this?" 3 days. Maybe 4. Mary died in childbirth, and nothing we've tried works. Dr. Wheeler says he needs human milk from a woman who's recently given birth. Jake's voice broke slightly. "Lizzie, I know what I'm asking. I know the risk. But please, he's all I have left." Elizabeth looked at the baby, then at Jake's desperate face, and Jake saw the moment her decision was made. The same fierce protectiveness that had made her defend wounded animals as a child, the same compassion that had drawn him to her all those years ago, flared to life. "Bring him here," she said, settling onto a stone bench beneath an arbor of bare vines. Jake's hands shook as he placed his son in Elizabeth's arms. The moment she touched the child, something seemed to ease in both of them. The baby's breathing steadied slightly, and Elizabeth's face softened with a peace Jake hadn't seen in years. "What's his name?" she asked, already beginning to arrange her wrapper to give the baby access to what he needed. "Samuel, after my father." Elizabeth smiled, the first real smile Jake had seen from her since he'd returned to Millbrook. "Hello, Samuel," she whispered to the baby. "Let's see if we can help you feel better." What happened next was both the most natural thing in the world and the most intimate moment Jake had ever witnessed. As Elizabeth guided his son to her breast, as the baby latched on with desperate hunger, as the morning sun painted them both in golden light, Jake felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of love, sacrifice, and what it meant to save a life. He also heard the sound of footsteps on the garden path and knew their time was running out. "Someone's coming," he whispered urgently. Elizabeth's eyes flew to his, wide with alarm, but she didn't stop nursing the baby. "The gardener," she said quickly. "He comes early on Wednesdays. Behind the potting shed, there's a gap in the hedge you can slip through." Jake hesitated, torn between staying to protect them and preserving the secrecy that might be their only hope of continuing these meetings. "When can I bring him back?" "Tomorrow morning, same time." "But Jake," Elizabeth's voice caught, "if Richard finds out—" "He won't," Jake promised, though he had no idea how he could keep such a promise. "Thank you, Lizzie. You're saving his life." As Jake slipped away through the hedge, the last thing he heard was Elizabeth's soft voice singing a lullaby he remembered from their childhood, and the contented sounds of a baby finally feeding. For the first time in days, Samuel Morrison was going to survive the night. But as Jake made his way home through the early morning streets, he couldn't shake the feeling that they'd started something that would be impossible to stop. Something that would either save them all or destroy everything they'd built from the ashes of their broken dreams. The change in Samuel was nothing short of miraculous. Within 12 hours of his first feeding with Elizabeth, the baby's color had improved from deathly pale to a healthy pink. His breathing steadied, his tiny fists unclenched, and for the first time since his birth, he slept peacefully through the night. Jake sat in his rocking chair, his son finally resting quietly against his chest, and felt a combination of overwhelming gratitude and terrifying awareness of what he'd set in motion. Elizabeth's milk had saved Samuel's life, but it had also created a bond that went far beyond the physical necessity of feeding a hungry child. The next morning, Jake arrived at the rose garden to find Elizabeth already waiting, pacing nervously among the dormant flower beds. She'd clearly been up for hours. Her hair was perfectly arranged, her dark green dress immaculate, but there were shadows under her eyes that spoke of a sleepless night. "How is he?" she asked immediately, reaching for the baby with hands that trembled slightly. "See for yourself," Jake said, pulling back the blanket to reveal Samuel's transformed appearance. Elizabeth's face lit up with wonder and relief. Oh, thank God. He looks like a completely different child. As she settled onto their stone bench and began to arrange her dress for nursing, Jake noticed the way her movements had become more confident, more purposeful. Yesterday she'd been tentative, almost frightened by the intimacy of the act. Today she moved with the natural grace of a mother tending her own child. Elizabeth, Jake began carefully, I need you to know how grateful I am. What you're doing, it goes beyond anything I had a right to ask. She looked up at him, Samuel already latching on hungrily. You don't need to thank me, Jake. This is healing something in me too. My body was made to feed a child, and losing Emma, her voice caught on the name of her dead daughter. Having Samuel need me, it makes the loss feel less like a waste. Jake knelt beside the bench, close enough to see the peaceful expression on his son's face, close enough to catch the faint scent of roses in Elizabeth's hair. Tell me about her, about Emma. Elizabeth's smile was sad but genuine. She was perfect. 10 tiny fingers, 10 tiny toes. She had your eyes. She had blue eyes like... Elizabeth caught herself, color rising in her cheeks. Like Samuel's. And she was so alert, so curious about everything. For 3 days, she was the center of my world. What happened? Fever. It came on so suddenly. One moment she was nursing normally. The next she was burning up and struggling to breathe. Dr. Wheeler tried everything, but Elizabeth's voice broke. Sometimes I think Richard was almost relieved. He never wanted children, you know. He only agreed because his mother insisted he needed an heir. The bitterness in her voice when she mentioned her husband sent a chill through Jake. Lizzie, does he hurt you? Elizabeth's laugh was hollow. Richard doesn't need to raise his hand to hurt someone. He's much more sophisticated than that. He hurts with words, with control, with making sure I know exactly how trapped I am. She looked down at Samuel, who was nursing contentedly. He's never forgiven me for not being the perfect society wife he thought he was buying, and he's certainly never forgiven me for not being able to forget you. The admission hung between them like a physical presence. Jake felt his heart racing, torn between joy that she'd never forgotten him and anger at the man who'd made her life a prison. Lizzie! Don't, she said quickly. Don't say whatever you're thinking of saying. We can't go down that path, Jake. Too much has happened. Too much has changed. But even as she spoke the words, her free hand moved unconsciously to touch his, where it rested on the bench beside her. The contact was electric, sending warmth shooting up Jake's arm and straight to his heart. They sat in silence for several minutes, watching Samuel feed, both lost in thoughts they couldn't voice. Finally, Elizabeth spoke again. How long will he need this? The nursing, I mean. Jake had been dreading this question because he honestly didn't know the answer. Dr. Wheeler says at least a few weeks, maybe longer, until he's strong enough to take other food or until we can find another wet nurse who has what he needs. Elizabeth nodded, but Jake could see her mind working. A few weeks of secret meetings. A few weeks of lying to Richard about where I go in the mornings. She looked up at him. You realize what will happen if he discovers this? He'll have me arrested. Or killed. He'll have us both destroyed, Elizabeth corrected. Me for adultery, even though that's not what this is. You for corrupting his wife. And Samuel. She looked down at the baby with fierce protectiveness. Richard would find a way to hurt Samuel too, just to punish us. Jake felt cold dread settle in his stomach. Then we'll be more careful. We'll find other times, other places. Where? Elizabeth's voice was sharp with frustration. Richard controls every moment of my day. He has the servants report on my activities. He monitors my correspondence. These early morning walks in the garden are the only freedom I have, and only because Dr. Wheeler told him that fresh air would help with my grief recovery. Before Jake could respond, they both heard it, the sound of heavy footsteps on the main garden path, moving toward them with deliberate purpose. Elizabeth went rigid, Samuel still nursing at her breast, her face draining of color. Richard, she whispered, he never comes to the garden. Never. Jake was already moving, carefully lifting Samuel from Elizabeth's arms while she frantically adjusted her dress. But there wasn't time to hide, wasn't time to run. They could hear Richard Carter's voice now, accompanied by another man's, someone Jake didn't recognize. "I tell you, something's not right with her lately," Richard was saying, his cultured voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "She's been different, more secretive. And yesterday Maria mentioned she thought she heard voices in the garden during Elizabeth's morning walk." Jake's blood turned to ice. Maria had been discovered. Their one ally in the Carter household had been compromised. Elizabeth was on her feet now, Samuel hidden against her chest beneath her shawl, doing her best to look like a grieving mother taking solace in her garden. But Jake could see the terror in her eyes, could practically feel her heart pounding with fear. "Behind the potting shed," she whispered urgently. "Now!" But it was too late. Richard Carter rounded the corner of the path at that moment, accompanied by Sheriff Bradshaw, and his calculating eyes took in the scene immediately. Elizabeth standing beside the bench, clearly flustered, and Jake Morrison frozen like a deer caught in torchlight, holding what was obviously a baby. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, suspicion, and finally a cold, terrible rage that made Jake's skin crawl. Sheriff Bradshaw, a man Jake knew to be firmly in Carter's pocket, rested his hand on his gun belt. "Well, well," Richard said softly, his voice like silk wrapped around steel. "What have we here?" Elizabeth lifted her chin with a courage that reminded Jake why he'd fallen in love with her all those years ago. "Richard, I can explain—" "Oh, I'm sure you can, my dear," Richard interrupted, never taking his eyes off Jake. "I'm sure you have a fascinating explanation for why you're having a secret rendezvous with Jake Morrison in our garden. At dawn, while you're clearly indisposed." His gaze flicked meaningfully to the damp spots on Elizabeth's dress that betrayed her recent nursing. Jake stepped forward, instinctively moving to protect Elizabeth, even though he knew it was useless. "Mr. Carter, your wife was helping me save my son's life. Nothing more." Richard's laugh was like breaking glass. "How noble, how touching, and how convenient that saving your son's life required my wife to—" He gestured vaguely at Elizabeth's disheveled appearance. "What exactly was she saving him with, Morrison?" The implication in his voice made Jake's hands clench into fists. "She was nursing him. My son was starving, and your wife's milk saved his life. It's that simple." "Simple," Richard repeated as if tasting the word. "Yes, I imagine you'd like to keep it simple. But nothing about this situation is simple, Morrison. My wife secretly meeting with her childhood sweetheart. My wife using her body to feed another man's child. My wife lying to me for God knows how long." "Richard, please," Elizabeth said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Samuel was dying. I couldn't let him die when I had the means to help." Richard turned to his wife with a look that made Jake's blood boil. "Couldn't let him die? How touching, how maternal. Tell me, Elizabeth, when our daughter was dying, did you fight half so hard to save her? Or was your concern reserved for the children of old lovers?" Elizabeth recoiled as if she'd been slapped, and Jake saw red. He took a step toward Richard, Samuel still in his arms, and it was only Sheriff Bradshaw's sharp movement toward his gun that stopped him. "That's enough," Jake growled. "Don't you dare blame her for Emma's death. And don't you dare make this into something it isn't." "Oh, but that's where you're wrong, Morrison," Richard said, his smile cold and predatory. "This is exactly what I say it is. My wife committing adultery, you corrupting a married woman, both of you defiling the sanctity of my home with your sordid affair." "We're not having an affair," Elizabeth protested desperately. "Aren't you?" Richard moved closer to his wife, and Jake saw her flinch. "Then explain to me, my dear, why your milk is flowing for his child when it never flowed properly for ours. Explain why you're glowing with health and happiness when you've been grieving and sickly for weeks. Explain why you're sneaking around like a common whore to feed the bastard son of your first love." The slap came so fast that Jake almost didn't see it. Elizabeth's hand connected with Richard's cheek with a crack that echoed through the garden, and the silence that followed was electric with danger. Richard's face went deadly calm. "Sheriff Bradshaw," he said quietly, never taking his eyes off Elizabeth's defiant face, "I want Jake Morrison arrested for trespassing, corruption of a married woman, and adultery. I want him in jail within the hour." "Richard, no!" Elizabeth grabbed her husband's arm desperately. "He hasn't done anything wrong." Richard shook her off roughly. "Haven't done anything wrong? He's seduced my wife into behaving like a common wet nurse. He's turned her into his whore, and he's done it all while pretending to be concerned about his dying child." Richard's voice dropped to a whisper. "The child who, frankly, might be better off dead than raised by a man like Jake Morrison." That was the moment Jake's control finally snapped. Still holding Samuel protectively against his chest, he lunged for Richard Carter with murder in his eyes. He never made it. Sheriff Bradshaw's club caught him behind the ear, and Jake Morrison collapsed to the ground, his world exploding into darkness as he heard Elizabeth screaming his name. Jake Morrison woke in the Millbrook jail with dried blood crusted behind his ear and the taste of iron in his mouth. The single cell was barely 6 feet by 8, with a cot, a bucket, and bars thick enough to cage a wild animal. Pale morning light filtered through a window set too high to reach, and somewhere in the distance he could hear a baby crying. Samuel. Jake struggled to sit up, his head pounding with each movement, and tried to piece together what had happened after Sheriff Bradshaw's club had sent him into darkness. Where was his son? Was he safe? And Elizabeth? God, what had Richard done to Elizabeth after Jake had been dragged away unconscious? "About time you woke up," came a familiar voice from outside the cell. Jake looked up to see Dr. Wheeler standing beyond the bars, his weathered face grim with concern. In his arms was Samuel, wrapped in a clean blanket, but crying with the desperate hunger of a baby who hadn't fed in hours. "Doc," Jake rasped, his throat raw. "How long have I been in here?" 6 hours. Long enough for Richard Carter to spin quite a tale to anyone who'll listen. Dr. Wheeler moved closer to the bars, adjusting his hold on the increasingly frantic baby. "He's telling folks you seduced his grieving wife, convinced her to act as a wet nurse for your bastard child so you could carry on an illicit affair." Jake's stomach clenched. "And people believe him?" "Some do. Others," Dr. Wheeler shrugged. "Well, let's say Richard Carter's never been beloved in this town. Too many families have lost their farms to his bank. Too many people have seen how he treats those with less power than him. But belief doesn't matter when he owns the sheriff and half the town council." Samuel's cries were getting weaker, more desperate. Jake could see his son's lips moving with the sucking reflex, searching for the nourishment only Elizabeth could provide. "He needs to feed, Doc." "It's been too long." "I know. I've tried everything again. Goat milk, cow milk, even that formula from back east. Nothing works." Dr. Wheeler's expression was grave. "This baby needs Elizabeth Carter's milk specifically, and Richard has made it clear that any attempt to contact his wife will result in additional charges against you." Jake gripped the bars until his knuckles went white. "So he's going to let Samuel starve to death just to punish me?" "And punish his wife," Dr. Wheeler added quietly. "From what I hear, Elizabeth hasn't left her room since yesterday morning. Richard's posted servants at her door, supposedly to protect her from the scandal. But we both know what that really means." Before Jake could respond, they heard footsteps echoing down the stone corridor. Sheriff Bradshaw appeared, his face flushed with self-importance and something that might have been guilt. "Visiting time's over, Doc," he said gruffly. "Mr. Carter wants to see the prisoner." Dr. Wheeler's jaw tightened. "This baby needs medical attention, Sheriff. He's going to die without proper nourishment." "Not my problem," Bradshaw replied, though he wouldn't meet the doctor's eyes. "Carter's orders are to keep Morrison isolated until the judge arrives from Silver Creek tomorrow." "Tomorrow?" Jake shot to his feet despite his throbbing head. "My son will be dead by tomorrow." "Should have thought of that before you started messing around with another man's wife," Bradshaw said, but his voice lacked conviction. Dr. Wheeler handed Samuel through the bars to Jake, ignoring the sheriff's protests. "Keep him warm. Keep him calm. I'll try to find another solution." As Dr. Wheeler left, promising under his breath to return soon, Jake was left alone with his dying son and the weight of his own helplessness. He paced the small cell, Samuel growing quieter and weaker in his arms, trying to think of any way out of this nightmare. An hour later, Richard Carter arrived like a dark cloud blocking the sun. He stood outside Jake's cell in his expensive suit, his face a mask of cold satisfaction, and studied the scene with obvious pleasure. "How touching," Richard said softly, "the devoted father and his dying child. Rather poetic, don't you think?" Jake moved to the bars. Samuel cradled protectively against his chest. "You bastard. You're letting an innocent baby die to satisfy your wounded pride." "Wounded pride?" Richard's laugh was like breaking glass. "Oh, Morrison, you understand nothing about this situation. This isn't about pride. This is about justice." "Justice?" Jake's voice was raw with fury. "What justice is there in letting a child starve?" Richard stepped closer to the bars, close enough that Jake could see the cold calculation in his eyes. "The justice of consequences. You see, I've spent 15 years building a life, a reputation, a position in this community. And you think you can waltz back into town and destroy all of that because of some childhood romance? I came back to build my own life, to forget about you and Elizabeth and move on." "But you didn't forget, did you?" Richard's smile was sharp as a blade. "You married poor Mary Henderson, but you never stopped watching Elizabeth. Never stopped hoping. And when the opportunity arose to insinuate yourself back into her life, you took it." Jake felt Samuel's breathing becoming more labored, more desperate. "She saved my son's life. That's all this was. Was it?" Richard pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket. "Because I have here a letter, Morrison. A letter Elizabeth started writing but never finished. Would you like to know what it says?" Jake's blood turned cold, but he said nothing. Richard unfolded the paper with deliberate slowness. "My dearest Jake," he read, his voice dripping with mock sweetness, "I cannot continue this charade any longer. Every moment I spend with you and Samuel reminds me of the life we should have had, the love we should have shared. When I hold your son to my breast, I pretend he is ours, that we are the family we always dreamed of being." Richard looked up from the letter. "Shall I continue?" Jake closed his eyes, understanding now how completely they'd been trapped. Elizabeth had written down her feelings, probably in a moment of grief and longing, and somehow Richard had found the letter. "She never gave it to me," Jake said quietly. "No, but she wrote it. She felt it. And that, Morrison, is all the proof I need that you've corrupted my wife beyond redemption. What do you want, Carter?" Richard's smile widened. "I want you gone. Permanently. I've already spoken to Judge Hamilton. He's an old friend, you understand, and he owes the bank several favors. You'll be convicted of adultery, corruption of a married woman, and trespassing. The sentence will be 5 years in the territorial prison, with the provision that you never return to this county." Jake felt his world collapsing. "And Samuel?" "Will die, I imagine, unless—" Richard paused dramatically. "Unless you're willing to make a deal." "What kind of deal?" Richard pulled out a second document, legal papers of some kind. "A confession. You admit to seducing my wife, to corrupting her for your own selfish purposes, and to using your dying child as a weapon against her maternal instincts. You publicly apologize to me and to the community for your actions, and you sign over custody of your son to Elizabeth and me." Jake stared at the papers in Richard's hand, understanding the true depth of the man's cruelty. "You want to take Samuel from me. I want to give him to Elizabeth. She needs a child to heal from the loss of our Emma. Your son will provide that healing, and in return, he'll live. He'll have a proper home, proper education, proper opportunities. Everything you could never give him. Under your roof, with you as his father." Richard's expression grew thoughtful. "I admit, the irony is satisfying. Raising the child of the man who tried to steal my wife. Watching Elizabeth pour all her maternal love into your son while knowing he'll never truly be hers. Yes, I think I could learn to appreciate the arrangement." Jake looked down at Samuel, whose tiny chest was barely moving now. His son was dying in his arms while this madman offered a devil's bargain. Samuel's life in exchange for Jake's freedom and fatherhood. "And if I refuse? Then you go to prison, your son dies, and Elizabeth spends the rest of her life knowing that her selfishness killed an innocent child." Richard's voice was conversational, as if they were discussing the weather. She's already blaming herself, you know. I've made sure of that. Before Jake could respond, they heard rapid footsteps in the corridor. Dr. Wheeler appeared, slightly out of breath and accompanied by an unexpected figure. Maria Santos, the Carter family housekeeper. "Sheriff," Dr. Wheeler called out. "I need to see the prisoner immediately. Medical emergency." Sheriff Bradshaw appeared from his office looking annoyed. "I told you, Doc, no more visits until—" "La Senora," Maria interrupted, her voice thick with tears and desperation. "La Senora Elizabeth, she is very sick. She needs El Bebé Samuel, and he needs her. Please, Sheriff, they both will die without each other." Richard's face went white. "What do you mean Elizabeth is sick?" Maria turned to her employer with eyes full of accusation. "You lock her in her room, Senor Carter. You tell the other servants she is not to be disturbed. But I hear her crying. I hear her calling for El Bebé. And now," Maria's voice broke, "now she has the fever. The same fever that took little Emma." The words hit Richard like a physical blow. For the first time since Jake had known him, Richard Carter looked genuinely afraid. "That's impossible," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Dr. Wheeler stepped forward. "Puerperal fever, Richard. Childbed fever. It can come back in women who've recently given birth, especially when they are under extreme emotional distress. Elizabeth's body is still producing milk, still in the vulnerable post-birth state. The stress you've put her under, the separation from the child she's been nursing." He shook his head grimly. "Her body thinks Samuel is her baby, Richard. Separating them is making her sick." Richard stared at the doctor, then at Maria, then at Jake holding his dying son. For a moment, Jake saw something almost human flicker across the man's face. Genuine fear for his wife's life. "How sick?" Richard asked quietly. "She burns with fever," Maria said. "She speaks of El Bebé Samuel. She calls for him in her sleep." "Her body," Maria gestured helplessly. "Her breasts, they are swollen and painful because the milk has no place to go. She needs to nurse the child, Senor Carter. It is the only way to heal her body and her heart." Dr. Wheeler nodded grimly. "I've seen it before, Richard. Women who lose children but continue producing milk. The physical and emotional trauma can trigger a fever that—" he paused meaningfully, "that can kill them if not treated properly." Richard was quiet for a long moment, staring at the confession papers in his hand, then at Jake holding Samuel. When he finally spoke, his voice was strained. "What are you saying, Doctor? That I have to choose between punishing Morrison and saving my wife's life?" "I'm saying," Dr. Wheeler replied carefully, "that your wife and this baby need each other to survive. Whatever's happened between you and Morrison, whatever mistakes have been made, 2 innocent lives hang in the balance. Elizabeth and Samuel. They need each other." Richard Carter stood in the dim jail corridor, faced with a choice between his revenge and his wife's life. And as Samuel gave a weak, barely audible cry in Jake's arms, they all held their breath to see which way his cruelty would bend. The silence in the jail corridor stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Richard Carter stood frozen between his desire for revenge and the stark reality that his wife might die if he didn't act. In Jake's arms, Samuel had gone frighteningly quiet, his tiny chest barely moving with each labored breath. Time was running out for everyone. Dr. Wheeler stepped closer to Richard, his voice urgent but carefully respectful. "Richard, I need you to understand what's happening to Elizabeth. Puerperal fever isn't just about grief or stress. It's her body's physical response to the trauma of losing Emma, combined with the ongoing milk production for Samuel. Every hour that passes without nursing increases the risk of infection, of losing her the same way we lost your daughter." The comparison to Emma's death hit Richard like a physical blow. Jake saw the man's composure crack slightly, saw genuine fear replace calculated cruelty in his eyes. "You're saying she could die?" Richard's voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm saying she will die if we don't treat this properly," Dr. Wheeler replied bluntly. "And the treatment is simple but non-negotiable. She needs to nurse Samuel. Her body needs the relief, the hormonal balance, the emotional connection. It's not about punishment or forgiveness anymore, Richard. It's about medical necessity." Maria Santos stepped forward, her dark eyes blazing with the fierce protectiveness of a woman who'd watched Elizabeth suffer for too long. Senor Carter, I have served your family for 20 years. I watched you court La Senora Elizabeth. I planned your wedding. I held your hand when little Emma was born. But I tell you now, if you let pride kill your wife, you will have nothing left but money and hatred. Richard turned to look at Jake through the bars, his face a mask of conflicted emotions. And what about him? What about the man who corrupted my wife, who turned her against me? Jake met Richard's gaze steadily, Samuel's failing form heavy in his arms. I never turned her against you, Carter. You did that all by yourself with 15 years of control and cruelty. But if you want to blame me for saving my son's life, if you want to call that corruption, then do it. Just don't let your hate kill Elizabeth and Samuel both. Don't lecture me about my wife, Richard snapped. But there was less venom in it than before. You have no idea what kind of marriage we have, what kind of... I know she's dying upstairs while you play games with her life, Jake interrupted, his voice raw with desperation. I know Samuel is dying in my arms while you debate whether your pride is worth more than their lives. And I know that if you let them both die for your revenge, you'll have to live with that choice for the rest of your miserable existence. Richard stared at Jake for a long moment, then at Dr. Wheeler, then at Maria's tear-stained face. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow, defeated. Sheriff Bradshaw, he called out, release the prisoner. Sheriff Bradshaw emerged from his office, looking confused. Sir? I thought you wanted him held until... I said release him, Richard repeated, his tone brooking no argument. Medical emergency. Dr. Wheeler's orders. As Bradshaw reluctantly unlocked the cell, Richard turned to Jake with eyes that burned with suppressed fury. This isn't forgiveness, Morrison. This is medical necessity. You will nurse your son with my wife under my supervision. When this crisis passes, when both Elizabeth and the child are stable, you will leave this county and never return. Is that understood? Jake nodded, too grateful to argue with the conditions. Understood. The walk to the Carter mansion felt like a funeral procession. Jake carried Samuel, whose breathing had become so shallow it was barely perceptible. Dr. Wheeler walked beside them, his medical bag clutched tight in his hands. Richard led the way, his face set in stone, while Maria hurried ahead to prepare Elizabeth's room. The Carter mansion felt different now, less like a fortress of wealth and more like a mausoleum. The servants they passed in the corridors kept their eyes down, but Jake could feel their curious and sympathetic gazes. Word of the crisis had clearly spread through the household. Elizabeth's bedroom door stood open, and the scene inside broke Jake's heart. She lay in the massive four-poster bed, her face flushed with fever, her hair damp with sweat. She was mumbling incoherently, her hands moving restlessly on the coverlet, as if searching for something, or someone. Samuel, she whispered, her eyes closed and unfocused. Where is Samuel? He needs. Dr. Wheeler immediately went to her side, checking her pulse and temperature. The fever's high, but not critical yet. How long has she been like this, Maria? Since this morning, doctor. She calls for El Bebe. She tries to get up to find him, but she is too weak. Jake approached the bed slowly, Samuel cradled against his chest. Elizabeth? Lizzie, can you hear me? Her eyes fluttered open at the sound of his voice, unfocused but searching. Jake? Is Samuel? He's here, Jake said softly, sitting on the edge of the bed despite Richard's sharp intake of breath. He needs you, Lizzie. You're the only one who can help him. Elizabeth struggled to sit up, her movements weak and unsteady. Maria immediately moved to help her, arranging pillows behind her back and gently guiding her to a position where she could nurse comfortably. Mi niño, Elizabeth whispered as Jake placed Samuel in her arms. My poor baby, you must be so hungry. What happened next was both miraculous and heartbreaking. As Elizabeth guided Samuel to her breast, both mother and child seemed to settle immediately. Samuel latched on with desperate hunger, his tiny hands gripping Elizabeth's nightgown as if afraid she might disappear again. Elizabeth's face, which had been tight with pain and fever, began to relax as her body responded to the familiar rhythm of nursing. That's it, Dr. Wheeler said approvingly, monitoring Elizabeth's pulse. Her body temperature is already starting to normalize. The physical relief of nursing will help reduce the fever significantly. Richard stood in the corner of the room, watching the intimate scene with an expression Jake couldn't read. There was pain there, certainly, and anger. But there was also something else. A grudging recognition of the bond between Elizabeth and Samuel. An understanding that what he was witnessing went beyond adultery or corruption. She loves him, Richard said quietly, almost to himself. She loves your son as if he were her own. Jake looked up from watching Samuel nurse, meeting Richard's gaze across the room. Yes, she does. And he needs that love to survive. More than he needs his father's love, apparently. The words stung, but Jake forced himself to remain calm. He needs both. But right now he needs the milk that only Elizabeth can provide. And she needs the healing that only he can give her. They sat in tense silence for several minutes, watching Elizabeth nurse Samuel back to health, while her own fever gradually subsided. Dr. Wheeler monitored them both, occasionally checking pulse rates and temperatures, nodding with satisfaction as both patients stabilized. Finally, Elizabeth looked up at her husband with clear eyes for the first time in days. Richard, I know you're angry. I know this situation looks improper, but this child was dying, and I had the means to save him. How could I do anything else? Richard moved closer to the bed, his face still hard, but less openly hostile. You could have told me. You could have asked my permission instead of sneaking around like a what? Elizabeth's voice was stronger now, fed by maternal protectiveness and the courage that came from holding a child who needed her. Like a woman with compassion? Like someone who values life over pride? Like someone who's still in love with her childhood sweetheart, Richard shot back. The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Elizabeth looked down at Samuel, who was nursing contentedly, then back at her husband with eyes that held both sadness and truth. Yes, she said quietly. I am still in love with Jake Morrison. I have been for 15 years, through every day of our marriage, through every night I've lain beside you, wishing I were somewhere else. But Richard, that doesn't change the fact that what I did for Samuel was right. It doesn't make this about adultery or corruption. It makes it about saving a child's life. The honesty of her admission seemed to deflate Richard's anger like air from a punctured balloon. He sat heavily in the chair beside the bed, looking suddenly older than his 42 years. So what happens now? He asked tiredly. Do I pretend this never happened? Do I ignore the fact that my wife just confessed to loving another man? Do I watch her nurse his child every day and pretend it doesn't tear me apart? Elizabeth shifted Samuel to her other arm, her movements now confident and natural. What happens now is that we save Samuel's life, however long that takes, whatever that requires. And then, she looked at Jake, her eyes full of pain and resignation. Then Jake takes his son and leaves, as you've demanded. And you and I figure out how to live with the choices we've all made. Jake felt something cold settle in his chest. Elizabeth, I never asked you to sacrifice. Yes, you did, she interrupted gently. The moment you brought Samuel to me, you asked me to choose between his life and my marriage, between doing what was right and doing what was safe. I made that choice, Jake, and I'd make it again. Dr. Wheeler cleared his throat diplomatically. The immediate crisis appears to be resolving. Elizabeth's fever is down, and the baby is feeding normally. But I should warn you all, this arrangement will need to continue for several weeks at minimum. Samuel's system has become accustomed to Elizabeth's milk specifically. Any attempt to wean him too quickly could cause a relapse. Richard's face went pale. Several weeks of this? Several weeks of your wife saving a child's life, Jake said firmly. Several weeks of her doing what any decent person would do in this situation. Several weeks of watching my wife play mother to another man's son while denying that she's in love with his father. Richard corrected bitterly. Elizabeth looked between the two men, her husband and her former lover, both torn apart by circumstances none of them had chosen. When she spoke, her voice was steady despite the tears in her eyes. Then maybe, Richard, it's time you decided what matters more. Your pride or your wife's life, my happiness or your control. Because I won't let Samuel die to preserve your ego, and I won't pretend anymore that our marriage is anything other than a prison I've been locked in for 15 years. The words fell into the room like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock and possibility through everyone present. Richard stared at his wife as if seeing her clearly for the first time, while Jake held his breath, afraid to hope that Elizabeth was finally finding the courage to fight for the life she wanted. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance, and the first drops of rain began to fall against the windows. The storm that had been brewing for 15 years was finally about to break. The rain that had begun as gentle drops against the windows had turned into a full storm by evening, with thunder shaking the Carter mansion's windows and lightning illuminating the tense scene in Elizabeth's bedroom. For 6 hours, she had nursed Samuel, while the three adults around her navigated the minefield of their shared history and impossible situation. Richard had barely spoken since Elizabeth's confession of love for Jake. He sat in the corner chair like a statue carved from bitterness, watching his wife tend to another man's child with a devotion she'd never shown their own marriage. Dr. Wheeler had left an hour ago, satisfied that both patients were stable, but promising to return in the morning to check on their progress. Jake remained beside the bed, unable to tear himself away from the sight of his son finally thriving. Samuel had fed 3 times since their reunion, each feeding stronger and more confident than the last. His color was good, his breathing steady, his tiny fists grasping at Elizabeth's nightgown with the instinctive trust of a child who knew he was safe. "He's beautiful," Elizabeth murmured, stroking Samuel's dark hair as he nursed sleepily at her breast. "He looks just like you did as a baby, Jake." The same stubborn chin, the same way of frowning when he's concentrating. Jake smiled despite the tension in the room. Mary used to say he had my temper. Even as a newborn, he knew what he wanted and wasn't shy about demanding it. "Smart boy," Elizabeth said softly. "Knowing what you want is half the battle in life. Fighting for it is the other half." The pointed comment wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Richard stirred from his brooding silence with a bitter laugh. "Fighting for what you want," he repeated. "How noble. How romantic. Tell me, Elizabeth, what exactly are you fighting for now? The chance to play house with your childhood sweetheart? The opportunity to mother his bastard while ignoring the vows you made to me?" Elizabeth looked up from Samuel with eyes that blazed with 15 years of suppressed anger. "I'm fighting for the right to save a child's life without being called a whore for it. I'm fighting for the chance to feel useful, needed, valued for something other than my ability to smile prettily at your business associates. And yes, Richard, I'm fighting for the memory of what love actually feels like." "You want to talk about love?" Richard stood abruptly, his composure finally cracking completely. "What about the love I've given you? The home, the security, the position in society? What about the 15 years I've spent building a life for us?" "Building a prison for me," Elizabeth corrected, her voice steady despite the tears beginning to flow. 15 years of being told when to speak and when to be silent, who to associate with and who to avoid, how to dress and how to act and how to feel. 15 years of being treated like a possession instead of a person. Jake shifted uncomfortably, feeling like an intruder in this intimate marital breakdown, but unable to leave while Samuel was still nursing. "Maybe I should take him," he said quietly. "Let you two work this out privately." "No," Elizabeth said firmly, tightening her hold on Samuel. "He's not finished eating, and he needs the comfort as much as the nourishment. This conversation is long overdue." Richard turned his attention to Jake with renewed fury. "This is your doing, Morrison. You came back to town with your dying child and your sob story, and you've turned my wife against me. You've poisoned her mind with romantic nonsense about what could have been." "I never asked her to choose," Jake replied honestly. "I asked her to save my son's life. Everything else was already broken long before I came back to Millbrook." "Was it?" Richard's smile was sharp with malice. "Because from where I stand, it looks like you've been planning this reunion for years. The perfect opportunity to play on Elizabeth's maternal instincts, to make her feel needed." "I don't know," Jake admitted finally. "I know Samuel needs Elizabeth's milk for several more weeks. I know she needs the healing that caring for him provides. Beyond that," he met Richard's hostile gaze directly. "Beyond that, it's not my choice to make." "Isn't it?" Richard's laugh was hollow. You've already made the choice, Morrison. The moment you brought your son to my wife, you made the choice. The moment you let her fall in love with him, you made the choice. And now we're all living with the consequences. Elizabeth struggled to sit up straighter, Samuel still cradled against her chest. Stop talking about me like I'm not here. Stop acting like I'm some helpless creature who can't think for herself or make her own decisions. Then make one, Richard said, turning to face his wife with eyes that burned with challenge and pain. Right now, Elizabeth. Choose. Choose your comfortable prison with me, or choose uncertainty and scandal with him. But choose, and stop torturing us all with this pretense that we can somehow make this situation work. The ultimatum fell between them like a gauntlet thrown down in challenge. Elizabeth looked at her husband, the man who'd controlled her life for 15 years but had never truly known her soul. Then she looked at Jake, the man she'd loved since childhood, but who represented a future full of unknowns and social ostracism. You want me to choose right now? Elizabeth's voice was quiet but steady. Tonight, while Samuel is still recovering, while my body is still healing, while we're all exhausted and emotional? Yes, Richard said firmly, because this limbo is killing me, Elizabeth. Watching you with him, watching you mother his child while you've never looked at me with half that tenderness. I can't do it for weeks. I won't. Elizabeth was quiet for a long moment, looking down at Samuel's peaceful face. When she finally spoke, her voice was filled with the kind of certainty that comes from facing the truth without flinching. Then I choose him, she said simply. I choose Jake and Samuel and whatever uncertain future that brings. Because Richard, you're right about one thing. This limbo is torture. But it's not torture because I'm torn between you and Jake. It's torture because I've been pretending for 15 years that I could learn to love you the way a wife should love her husband, and I can't. I've tried, God knows I've tried, but I can't. The confession hit Richard like a physical blow. He staggered backward as if she'd struck him, his face cycling through shock, pain, and finally a terrible kind of relief. You're choosing poverty, he said quietly. You're choosing scandal. You're choosing to be the town pariah, the woman who abandoned her marriage for her childhood sweetheart. Do you understand what you're giving up? Elizabeth smiled, and it was the first truly peaceful expression Jake had seen on her face since his return to Millbrook. I'm giving up security for happiness. I'm giving up status for love. I'm giving up a beautiful prison for an uncertain freedom. She looked at Jake, her eyes shining with tears and determination. Yes, I understand exactly what I'm giving up, and I understand exactly what I'm choosing instead. Jake felt his heart swell with a mixture of joy and terror. Elizabeth, are you sure? Richard's right about the consequences. The town will never accept us. They'll call you an adulteress, call Samuel a bastard, call me a homewrecker. We'll be outcasts. Then we'll be outcasts together, Elizabeth replied firmly. Jake, I've spent 15 years being respectable and miserable. I'd rather spend the rest of my life being scandalous and happy. Richard stood frozen for a moment, absorbing the finality of his wife's decision. Then, with movements that seemed to age him 10 years in as many seconds, he walked to his dresser and pulled out a small leather portfolio. Very well, he said, his voice hollow but strangely calm. If that's your choice, Elizabeth, then we'll make it official. He opened the portfolio and began pulling out legal documents. Divorce papers. I've had them prepared for months ever since I realized that Morrison's return to town was inevitable. Elizabeth stared at her husband in shock. You've had divorce papers prepared for months? I'm not a fool, my dear. I could see the way you looked whenever his name was mentioned. I could see the way you withdrew from me after he built that ranch just outside town. I knew this day would come. I just didn't expect it to involve a dying baby and a milk-soaked nightgown. Richard's bitter humor couldn't hide the pain in his voice, and for the first time, Elizabeth looked at her husband with something approaching compassion. Richard, I never wanted to hurt you. I know that sounds hollow now, but it's true. No, Richard replied, signing the divorce papers with swift, decisive strokes. You wanted to love me. That's different, and the tragedy is that I always knew the difference, but I married you anyway. thinking I could make you forget him through sheer force of will and financial security. He handed the signed papers to Elizabeth, who took them with trembling hands. There. You're free, Elizabeth. Free to love whomever you choose. Free to raise whatever children you see fit. Free to live whatever life you want. Just not in my house. The practical reality of her choice hit Elizabeth like cold water. Where will I go? What will I do? Jake stepped forward, his voice quiet but firm. You'll come home with Samuel and me, if you want to, if you're sure. Elizabeth looked around the opulent bedroom that had been her prison for 15 years, then down at the baby sleeping peacefully in her arms, the child who had saved her as much as she had saved him. When she looked up at Jake, her smile was radiant with possibility. Yes, she said simply. Yes, I'm sure. Outside, the storm was beginning to pass, but inside the Carter mansion, the real storm was just beginning. Because while Elizabeth had made her choice, the town of Millbrook still had to reckon with a scandal that would shake its foundations and challenge everything they thought they knew about love, duty, and the courage it takes to choose happiness over security. The hardest part was still to come. 3 months later, the scandal had settled into the rhythm of Millbrook's daily life like dust after a windstorm. Still visible if you looked for it, but no longer the consuming focus of every conversation. Elizabeth Morrison, she'd taken Jake's name the day after her divorce was finalized, stood on the porch of their modest ranch house, watching her husband teach their son to hold his head up during feeding time. Their son. The words still filled her with wonder. Samuel had thrived under Elizabeth's care, growing from the failing infant she'd first held in the rose garden into a robust, healthy baby who smiled at the sound of her voice and reached for her with chubby fingers whenever she entered the room. Dr. Wheeler declared him completely recovered, no longer dependent on Elizabeth's milk for survival, but she continued nursing him because it brought them both joy and peace. He's getting strong, Jake said, settling beside Elizabeth on the porch swing they'd built together last month. Samuel was cradled in his arms, having just finished his afternoon feeding, contentedly gurgling at the late autumn sky. He knows he's loved, Elizabeth replied, leaning against Jake's shoulder with the casual intimacy of a couple who'd found their way back to each other after years of separation. That makes all the difference. The transition hadn't been easy. For the first month, they'd faced cold stares at the general store, whispered conversations that stopped when they walked into church, and the loss of several friendships that couldn't survive Elizabeth's disgraceful choices. Mrs. Whitmore had publicly declared that no decent woman would associate with an adulteress, and the ladies' sewing circle had made it clear that Elizabeth was no longer welcome. But they'd also found unexpected allies. Dr. Wheeler had been vocal in his support, reminding anyone who'd listen that Elizabeth had saved a child's life and shown more Christian charity than half the so-called righteous people in town. Maria Santos had left the Carter household to work for them, declaring that she'd rather serve a family built on love than one built on money and control. Even Sheriff Bradshaw, who'd initially arrested Jake, had quietly apologized and admitted that watching a baby thrive under Elizabeth's care had changed his perspective on the whole situation. Mrs. Henderson stopped by while you were in town, Elizabeth said, adjusting her position so she could see both Jake and Samuel clearly. She brought a pot roast and an apology. Jake raised an eyebrow. Martha Henderson? The town's biggest gossip? The same. Apparently, she's decided that any woman brave enough to choose love over security deserves respect rather than censure. Elizabeth smiled. She also mentioned that several other ladies have been asking about visiting. It seems public opinion is slowly shifting in our favor. And Richard? Jake asked quietly. It was the question they both danced around most days, the elephant in their comfortable room. Elizabeth was quiet for a moment, watching Samuel's tiny fingers wrap around Jake's thumb. He's leaving Millbrook, selling the bank and the house, moving back east to Philadelphia, where his family has connections. Maria heard it from the other servants. Jake felt a complex mixture of relief and something that might have been pity. How do you feel about that? Free, Elizabeth said simply. For the first time in my adult life, I feel completely free. He can't hurt us anymore, can't use his influence to make our lives difficult. We can just Be happy. Samuel chose that moment to let out a contented sigh, his eyes fluttering closed as he settled into the deep sleep of a well-fed, well-loved baby. Jake looked down at his son with an expression of pure adoration that made Elizabeth's heart skip. "I never thanked you properly," Jake said softly, "for what you did, for what you gave up." Elizabeth reached over to stroke Samuel's dark hair, so like his father's. "You don't need to thank me, Jake. This little boy saved me as much as I saved him. He gave me a purpose when I thought my life was over, and he brought me back to you. I should be thanking him." "He brought us all back to each other," Jake agreed. "Though I have to admit, I never imagined it would happen this way." Elizabeth laughed, the sound light and joyful in the autumn air. "Did you imagine it happening at all? When you married Mary, when I was trapped in my marriage to Richard, did you ever think we'd get a second chance?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, remembering the years of glimpsed glances across crowded rooms, the careful distance they'd maintained, the resigned acceptance that their love belonged to the past. "No," he admitted. "I thought we'd missed our chance forever. I thought the best I could hope for was catching sight of you at church on Sundays and remembering what love felt like when we were 17. And now?" Jake shifted Samuel to one arm so he could wrap the other around Elizabeth, pulling her close against his side. "Now I wake up every morning next to the woman I've loved since I was old enough to understand what love meant. Now I watch her mother my son with more tenderness than I ever dared hope for. Now I get to plan a future that includes both of you." Elizabeth turned in his arms to look at him directly, her eyes bright with tears of happiness. "Do you ever regret it? The scandal, the difficulties, the way some people still look at us?" "Never," Jake said firmly. "Elizabeth, I'd face down the entire territory's disapproval to have this life with you and Samuel. Some people will always judge us for how we found our way back to each other, but the people who matter understand that love doesn't follow a schedule or respect social conventions." As if summoned by their conversation, they heard the sound of hooves on the drive. A familiar buggy appeared around the bend, Dr. Wheeler returning from his weekly check on Samuel's progress, though they all knew these visits had become more social than medical. "Afternoon, folks," Dr. Wheeler called out, climbing down from his buggy with the careful movements of a man in his 70s. "How's our young man doing today?" "See for yourself," Jake said, carefully transferring the sleeping Samuel to the doctor's experienced hands. Dr. Wheeler examined the baby with gentle efficiency, checking his color, his reflexes, the steady rhythm of his breathing. "Perfect," he declared with satisfaction. "Absolutely perfect. This child is the picture of health and happiness." "Thanks to Elizabeth," Jake said, his voice warm with gratitude and love. Dr. Wheeler looked at Elizabeth with eyes that held deep respect. "Thanks to both of you. This boy is thriving because he's surrounded by love, security, and parents who would do anything to protect him. That's the best medicine any child can have." Elizabeth accepted Samuel back into her arms, marveling again at how perfectly he fit against her chest, how completely he'd become the center of their world. "Dr. Wheeler," she said hesitantly, "may I ask you something?" "Of course, my dear. Do you think we did the right thing? All of us, I mean. The way everything happened. The choices we made?" Dr. Wheeler settled into the rocking chair they kept on the porch for visitors, his weathered face thoughtful. "Elizabeth, in 50 years of practicing medicine, I've learned that life rarely gives us perfect choices. We do the best we can with the circumstances we're given, and we try to minimize the harm while maximizing the good." He gestured toward Samuel, who was starting to stir in Elizabeth's arms. "That child was dying. You had the means to save him, and you did, regardless of the personal cost. Jake was willing to sacrifice his freedom and his future to ensure his son's survival. Even Richard, in the end, chose his wife's life over his pride." Dr. Wheeler paused, looking out over the rolling hills that surrounded the Morrison Ranch. "Yes, Elizabeth, I think you all did the right thing. Maybe not the conventional thing, maybe not the thing that makes the town gossips comfortable, but the right thing, the loving thing." As evening fell and Dr. Wheeler departed with promises to return next week, Jake and Elizabeth sat together on their porch swing, Samuel nursing peacefully as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. They didn't talk much. After years of separation and months of rebuilding their life together, they'd learned to find comfort in shared silence. "Jake," Elizabeth said finally, her voice soft in the gathering darkness. "Mmm, I love you. I love this life we've built. I love our son and our home and the way you look at me like I'm the most precious thing in your world." Jake pressed a kiss to the top of her head, breathing in the scent of roses that had clung to her hair since their first meeting in Richard's garden. "You are the most precious thing in my world. You and Samuel both." Samuel had finished nursing and was now gazing up at Elizabeth with the serious expression of a baby trying to make sense of the world around him. She smiled down at him, her heart overflowing with a happiness she'd never thought possible. "Hello, my beautiful boy," she whispered. "Did you know that you're the reason Mama and Papa found each other again? Did you know that you saved us all?" Samuel gurgled a response that might have been agreement, and both his parents laughed with the pure joy of a family that had fought for their right to exist and won. In the distance, a coyote howled at the rising moon, but here on the Morrison Ranch porch, surrounded by love and the promise of all the tomorrows stretching ahead of them, Jake and Elizabeth Morrison held their son close and knew that some battles, the ones fought for love, for family, for the right to choose happiness over convention, were always worth winning, no matter what anyone else might say. And that's how Elizabeth Carter became Elizabeth Morrison, how a dying baby became the bridge between two lovers separated by 15 years of heartbreak, and how an act of maternal compassion transformed into one of the most beautiful love stories the frontier ever witnessed. Think about what we just experienced together. A woman trapped in a loveless marriage found the courage to risk everything, her security, her reputation, her entire social standing, to save the life of her secret lover's child. A man desperate to save his son's life discovered that sometimes the greatest gift you can receive is watching someone else love your child as their own. And a baby who should have died became the living symbol of love's power to heal, to unite, and to triumph over the cruelest circumstances. But this story is about so much more than forbidden love or scandalous romance. It's about the incredible bond between a mother and child, even when that child isn't biologically hers. Elizabeth's body responded to Samuel's need with the same fierce protectiveness she would have shown her own baby, proving that motherhood isn't just about biology. It's about choice, commitment, and the willingness to put a child's needs above your own comfort. It's also about the courage it takes to choose authenticity over approval. Elizabeth could have continued living her comfortable lie, playing the role of the perfect banker's wife, while her heart slowly died from neglect. Instead, she chose to fight for genuine happiness, even when it meant facing social ostracism and economic uncertainty. Jake's journey reminds us that true love sometimes requires us to accept help from unexpected sources, to swallow our pride for the sake of someone we love more than ourselves. He could have let his son die rather than expose Elizabeth to scandal, but he chose to trust in the strength of their connection and the power of her compassion. Even Richard Carter, the story's antagonist, showed us something profound about human nature. His final choice to release Elizabeth rather than destroy them all revealed that even the most controlling people are capable of recognizing when love is real and letting go of what was never truly theirs to begin with. Samuel, the tiny catalyst who brought them all together, represents the innocent power of need meeting love. He didn't ask to be born into complicated circumstances, but his very existence forced three adults to confront their deepest truths about love, sacrifice, and what really matters in life. This story unfolded in 1881, but its themes are timeless. How many of us have felt trapped by circumstances beyond our control? How many have had to choose between security and happiness, between what's expected and what's authentic? How many have discovered that sometimes the greatest love stories begin with the simplest act of compassion? Elizabeth and Jake's love didn't conquer all. It required sacrifice, courage, and the willingness to face consequences. But it proved that when love is real, when it's worth fighting for, it can survive separation, overcome obstacles, and create something beautiful from the ashes of broken dreams. What did you think of Elizabeth's ultimate choice? Could you see yourself having the courage to walk away from security for the chance at genuine love? Have you ever experienced the transformative power of caring for someone else's child as if they were your own? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We love hearing how these frontier tales of love and courage inspire you in your own lives. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that true love is worth fighting for, regardless of the obstacles, make sure to hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear this message of hope and redemption. Subscribe to Wild West Stories for more incredible tales of love triumphing over adversity, and ring that notification bell so you never miss our latest adventures from the American frontier. Remember, real love doesn't follow society's rules. It follows the heart. And sometimes the most beautiful families are the ones we choose rather than the ones we're born into. Thanks for joining Elizabeth, Jake, and Samuel on their journey from heartbreak to happiness, partner. Until next time, keep believing in the power of love to overcome anything. Like this video if you believe love is worth fighting for, and subscribe for more legendary frontier stories that prove the human heart always finds a way.